So today I want to talk about 17 states. I want to talk about the 17 states that are backing the motion of Texas to put forward a Supreme Court case that would essentially overthrow and overturn the election. Now, this court case comes on the heels of Kelly versus Pennsylvania being just completely dismissed by the Supreme Court. Kelly versus Pennsylvania basically was trying to criticize the position of the state of Pennsylvania for their no excuse absentee voting system and said that it violated Pennsylvania and U.S. constitutional law. The response of the court was as such. The application for injunction relief presented to Justice Alito and by him referred to the court is denied. 9 justices, 6 of which are conservative, 3 of which were appointed by Trump. Not one of them had anything to say to dissent to this, or to put anything out there. 9-0 dismissal. If that doesn't tell you that there's something wrong with a lot of these court cases, I don't know what else to say to you. Being completely rational and reasonable within the laws and confines of the United States, which I'm going to just put it out there. I'm an anarchist. I want to see capitalism and I want to see the state abolished, and I want a much better world based not on vertical hierarchy, but, horizontal structures of actually getting things done and making sure people are functional. But having to live in this level of constitutionalism and what we exist in, this particular position is the position taken by a court that's overwhelmingly conservative. And unless you are going to tell me that Amy Coney Barrett is now somehow part of the deep state, there is no reason to believe any of these cases have the validity that a lot of people seem to think that they do. I'm running out of energy to be reasonable with all this. And I am someone who prides myself in my prior videos. I hope that speaks loudly and clearly that I try to be reasonable with people's perspectives and explain why I come to a different conclusion and why I think they're wrong. And I'm running out of the energy to do that and be reasonable because none of this seems to make sense. The 17 states in question, besides Texas, who put forward the motion, are Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, and West Virginia. And they are talking about overthrowing a lot of electoral votes in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And the charge, of course, is being led by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who still has not had his charges, the indictment that he received in 2015 for felony security fraud charges, addressed, which makes him the absolute best person to put on the forefront of a position where we're trying to address fraud. So the essential argument by the 17 states is kind of a 3-part thing. Part 1 states that the states in question, the 4 that I listed, did something unconstitutional or illegal within the understanding of the legislature's power in the Constitution. And therefore, their votes are not valid. The second thing that it essentially states is that there's rampant voter fraud whenever you have mail-in ballots. And the third thing that's kind of hinted at in the background is that the states were not rigorous enough at handling any of this between the combination of these 2 previous points. And so I have here from the actual court documentation, Texas versus Pennsylvania, States have a strong interest in ensuring that the votes of their own citizens are not diluted by the unconstitutional administration of elections in other states. When non-legislative actors in other states encroach on the authority of the legislature thereof in the state to administer a presidential election, they threaten the liberty not just of their own citizens, but of every citizen of the United States who casts a lawful ballot in that election. It goes on to say, for decades, responsible observers have cautioned about the risks of fraud and abuse in voting by mail, and they have urged the adoption of statutory safeguards to prevent such fraud and abuse. I'm going to address the second point first. There's no rampant voter fraud. There's no history, decades-long studies of rampant voter fraud through mail-in ballots. From a sample in 2016 and 2018 that included 14.6 million votes cast by mail, 0.0025% were found to be fraudulent. Most of the fraud is found, and it is dismissed when mistakes happen, because mistakes happen, and oftentimes without fraud, they're dismissed. But we're talking about votes in the numbers of hundreds, not the thousands upon thousands upon thousands. And the fact that I still have to say this, and the fact that this is still a conversation after all this time, there's no convincing people at this point. The fraud is not rampant from mail-in ballots. There's no decades-long history. If you have an article, prove it to me, because I have not seen it. There's nothing. There's nothing out there. So I'm going to dismiss that, and I'm also going to flat out dismiss the understanding that they weren't rigorous enough, just offhand, for preventing voter fraud. Every state has rigorous institutions. Voter fraud has been found in many places, and it's been dealt with accordingly. And again, it's in very small quantities. So the rigor speaking to that, I'm just dismissing all the voter fraud stuff, get it out there. Let's deal with the other issue. The other issue being that these states have somehow violated the position of the legislature in the Constitution. Well, the actual documentation in Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution is as followed. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress, but no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. You can read the rest of it, but that's basically the gist of it, and it ends up going on to talk about how Congress can determine the time that the electors are chosen and by a certain date. So, essentially, what is going on here is that Texas and all of these 17 other states are coming together and trying to sue the 4 other states, saying that they violated this particular portion of the document. However, these are the states that are largely Republican, largely in the South, and are usually the proponents of states' rights. This confuses me, because the general understanding would be that the states have a right and ability to manage themselves as they see fit. So if they decide to put forward an election in a certain way that makes sense to them, such as having as much mail-in voting as possible, or having the Supreme Court make the decision that the legislature is perfectly fine with, that you can extend the date for the election during a pandemic, that is perfectly fine. And as long as the rules are set beforehand, which they were, nobody should have an issue with it. And I'm reminding people, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed for this. And I need to speak to something. The letter of the law is not as important as the spirit of it. The point of these election laws is to ensure a fair, legitimate election where as many people in this country, this democracy, this pseudo-democracy republic that we have, can get some level of enfranchisement. You are trying to ensure enfranchisement of as many people as possible. So when you have a system in place that allows for an emergency to happen such as a pandemic on a global scale, asking people to mail in vote because having people come to the actual polls is dangerous. And you have a situation where the majority of people are polarized in that direction, you're going to get the type of election and situation that we did. That's just how this is going to work. Furthermore, the position of Pennsylvania was not, oh, you can vote after the date of the election. It was, we're going to take into account the amount of time it takes for ballots to arrive at a specific place so they can be counted. And historically, this has been done in this country since its inception. It used to take months to figure out who the president was, gathering all the votes, having them counted, having them traveled from place to place. We are in a place and a world where we have the luxury of that being done in a few days. So the Supreme Court ruled that Pennsylvania had a few days to do this, and any votes that came in between that time would be dismissed. But if they were postmarked before a certain time and they arrived by a certain time, everything was valid. That isn't illegal, that's not unconstitutional, that is keeping with the spirit of the law, which is the enfranchisement of as many people as possible. If you're trying to speak out against this because you want to play, I want to win rather than I want to actually hear what people have to say, then by all means, say that you're anti-democratic and just be done with it. And I don't have to argue with you because I'll just know that we agree to disagree. That said, I also want to point out that there are 46 states in this country who have regulations on the books already in case a state of emergency happens. Some of the most strict being some of the states on there, such as Florida, whose law covers everything from canceling and rescheduling an election, requiring that the polls have emergency guidelines. You can literally cancel the election in Florida. Oklahoma, who I saw on there. Oklahoma requires the Secretary of State Election Board declare an election emergency, which is independent of a declared state of emergency. Once an election emergency is declared, the Secretary of State has the authority to cancel and reschedule an election or provide a means to continue the election. So those are 2 of those 17 states. On there also is California and Virginia. And there are plenty of other states, including Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina, who also have the ability to delay or relocate an election. South Dakota has this. Utah can delay and reschedule an election in case of an emergency. So no, there's plenty of constitutionality for all this. And I also want to talk about, as an endpoint, the constitutionality of one state suing another over this, because it's absolutely absurd and ridiculous. They have the right within Pennsylvania to do what they do, to make their laws, to handle things the way that they do. And if this ends up going through, I don't think states like Texas are going to want to deal with the backlash when you start having states from all across the country starting to sue each other over, well, the fact that a person in Texas has a gun makes it less of a right for me as a person in this other state, or the fact that Texas has voting that's done by drive-in, that makes it a problem compared to my state. You're going to have all these nuanced little laws and lawsuits going through. You don't even know the civil rights lawsuits that are going to go through if you actually back this up. And honestly, the social justice laws that could pass because of the same principle that's being used here are countless. And honestly, it would almost be funny. It would almost be funny if people were actually keeping to the legitimacy of their positions and not just backpedaling, because, states' rights, right? States' rights. That's what the Republicans and the South has always stood for. No, it hasn't. It's another convenient ploy to try to ensure that Trump ends up the president and to dismiss the enfranchisement, the votes of 4 entire states in favor of putting a proto-fascist into power and maintain his position. This is the guy who's talked about wanting to maintain power for well more than 4 years and 8 years, and nobody seems to want to take that part of it seriously. It's just a joke, right? Ha ha ha. That's how fascism happens. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.